This cultivation might begin with something as simple as paying attention, the kind of deep, patient, genuinely curious attention that the Norse brought to their observation of wolf and raven behavior in the northern landscape, an attention that is not merely the casual noticing of a creature's presence, but a sustained, deliberate engagement with the full complexity of the animal's life and behavior, an engagement that is willing to be surprised, willing to be challenged, willing to discover in the animal something that exceeds one's prior expectations and that complicates one's existing understanding of what the animal is and what it represents. Modern science has provided us with extraordinary tools for this kind of attention, from the radio tracking and GPS monitoring technologies that allow researchers to follow individual wolves through vast territories over months and years, to the behavioral experiments that reveal the remarkable cognitive abilities of ravens, to the genetic analyses that illuminate the evolutionary history of the human-wolf relationship and the ways in which our two species have been shaping each other's evolutionary trajectories for tens of thousands of years. These scientific tools are not obstacles to the kind of sacred attention that the Norse brought to wolves and ravens, but are, in their own way, expressions of it, extensions of the human capacity for paying attention to the non-human world that are continuous with, rather than opposed to, the observational traditions that gave rise to the Norse sacred animal relationships in the first place. But scientific attention alone is not sufficient to recover the full depth of the relationship that the Norse maintained with wolves and ravens, because the Norse relationship was not merely observational, but was also imaginative and emotional and spiritual, encompassing not just the careful observation of animal behavior, but the willingness to be moved by it, to be changed by it, to allow the encounter with the wolf and the raven to challenge and to expand one's understanding of what consciousness is and what the world is and what it means to be alive in it. This dimension of the relationship requires not just the tools of science, but the tools of art and storytelling and ritual, and what we might call, for lack of a better term, spiritual practice. The practices of attention and contemplation and engagement that allow the significance of our encounters with the non-human world to sink into us more deeply than ordinary observation permits, to become not merely data points in our understanding of the world, but genuine transformative experiences that change the way we see and feel and think about the relationship between the human and the non-human, between the civilized and the wild, between the mortal and the sacred. The Norse sacred animal tradition offers us, across the centuries, both a model and an inspiration for this kind of deep, transformative engagement with the non-human world, a model that is richer and more philosophically sophisticated than almost anything that the modern world has produced in its place, and an inspiration that speaks to the deepest levels of the human need for a living relationship with the powers and the presences that exceed the purely human and that give human life its context and its meaning. The wolves and the ravens are still out there, still offering to those who are willing to pay attention the same lessons about strength and wisdom and the sacred indifference of the natural world that they offered to the Vikings, who first learned to see them as manifestations of the Vikings, divine. The question that the Norse sacred animal tradition finally asks us, in its deepest and most honest voice, is not whether we believe in Odin or in the Norse cosmology or in any of the specific theological content that the old tradition expressed through its stories of wolves and ravens and gods and fate. The question it asks is simpler and more demanding than that. A question that goes to the heart of what it means to be a conscious creature in a world that is vastly larger and older and more complex than any human civilization, a world that produced us and that will outlast us, and that, in the yellow eyes of the wolf and the black eyes of the raven, is still watching us with the same quality of ancient, patient, unflinching attention that it has always brought to the brief and brilliant experiment of human consciousness. The question is whether we are paying attention in return, and whether, if we are, we have the courage to let what we see change us. Ravens are among the most important scavengers in the boreal and Arctic ecosystems of the northern world, consuming the remains of animals killed by wolves and other predators, and thereby accelerating the decomposition and nutrient cycling processes that maintain the fertility of northern soils. They are also important seed dispersers, consuming berries and other fruits, and depositing the seeds in their droppings across wide areas of the landscape, contributing to the regeneration and the diversity of plant communities. And they are, as we have already noted, important partners of wolves in the hunting process, providing aerial reconnaissance that enhances the wolves' hunting success, and thereby contributing indirectly to the predator-prey dynamics that maintain the health of the ecosystem as a whole. The raven's role in the ecosystem is, in other words, precisely analogous to its role in the Norse mythological framework, a creature that moves between different levels of the system, that transfers information and energy across the boundaries that separate different domains of the living world, and whose activities contribute to the maintenance of a dynamic balance that would be disrupted by its absence. The convergence between the Norse mythological understanding of wolves and ravens as sacred maintainers of the cosmic order and the modern ecological understanding of these animals as keystone species whose activities are fundamental to the health and the stability of northern ecosystems is one of the most remarkable and most thought-provoking aspects of the Norse sacred animal tradition's continued relevance in the modern world. It suggests that the Norse, through their centuries of intimate observation of wolves and ravens in the northern landscape, and through the sophisticated mythological framework they developed to make sense of what they observed, had arrived at an understanding of the ecological significance of these animals that was, in its essential structure, if not in its specific content, genuinely accurate, an understanding that expressed in spiritual and mythological terms the same fundamental truths about the role of predators and scavengers in maintaining the health of ecosystems that modern ecology has now documented through systematic, empirical research. This convergence does not, of course, make the Norse mythological framework scientifically valid, and it would be a mistake to conflate the mythological understanding of sacred animals with the scientific understanding of keystone species, because these are fundamentally different kinds of knowledge operating within fundamentally different frameworks of inquiry and validation. But it does suggest that the Norse practice of attending carefully and respectfully to the behavior and the significance of wolves and ravens, of taking these animals seriously as beings whose activities had consequences that extended far beyond the immediately observable, was not merely a cultural or spiritual practice, but was also, in its own way, a form of ecological knowledge, a form of understanding the natural world that, while expressed in a different language than the one we use today, was pointing toward some of the same truths about the structure and the dynamics of the living world. As we move toward the final pages of this long exploration of the Viking relationship with wolves and ravens, it is worth pausing to consider what it means, in the most personal and the most immediate sense, to engage with this tradition in the modern world, what it might actually look and feel like to recover something of the Norse quality of attention toward these animals, to begin to see the wolf and the raven not merely as interesting biological organisms or evocative cultural symbols, but as sacred presences that have something genuine and important to teach us about the nature of the world and our place within it. This is not a question that can be answered in abstract or theoretical terms alone, because the Norse relationship with wolves and ravens was not primarily an abstract or theoretical relationship, but was lived, embodied, experiential, rooted in the direct encounter with real animals, in real landscapes, and in the practices and the stories and the rituals through which the significance of those encounters was amplified and made available to the entire community. To recover something of this relationship in the modern world requires not just intellectual engagement with the Norse tradition, but a willingness to go beyond the intellectual and to cultivate the kind of direct, attentive, respectful engagement with the non-human world that the Norse maintained as a matter of spiritual discipline and cultural practice, and that the spiritual work of modern Norse paganism must therefore include the work of ecological restoration and the cultivation of genuine relationships with the living animals that embody the sacred traditions of the old faith. This debate within the Asatru community reflects a broader tension in modern spiritual culture between the textual and the experiential, between the recovery of spiritual traditions through study and the recovery of spiritual traditions through direct engagement with the natural and the non-human world, a tension that is not unique to Norse paganism, but that is particularly acute in a tradition whose sacred animal relationships were so deeply embedded in direct ecological experience. The resolution of this tension, if it can be resolved, may require a synthesis of both approaches, a combination of serious engagement with the textual and archaeological evidence for the Norse sacred animal tradition and direct, embodied engagement with the living wolves and ravens that are still present in the world, still available to teach, still offering to those who are willing to pay attention the same lessons about the nature of reality and the possibilities of consciousness that they offered to the Norse people who first learned to see them as sacred. The conservation movement's growing recognition of the spiritual and cultural dimensions of human relationships with wolves and ravens provides an unexpected point of convergence between the ancient Norse sacred animal tradition and the contemporary ecological crisis, a convergence that suggests that the Norse understanding of these animals as sacred presences deserving of respect and serious engagement may be not merely of historical interest, but of genuine practical relevance to the challenges that face the modern world. The work of conservation biologists and wildlife managers who advocate for wolf and raven protection often draws, explicitly or implicitly, on a recognition that these animals have a significance that exceeds their purely ecological function, that they are keystone species in a cultural as well as a biological sense, creatures whose presence or absence from a landscape affects not just the ecological dynamics of that landscape, but the spiritual and psychological relationship that the human communities who share that landscape maintain with the non-human world. This recognition, while it is expressed in the language of conservation science rather than in the language of Norse mythology, is structurally continuous with the Norse understanding of wolves and ravens as sacred presences whose relationship to the human world was mediated by forces that exceeded the purely practical and the purely material. The reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park in the United States in 1995, which has become one of the most studied and most celebrated examples of ecological restoration in the history of conservation biology, provides a compelling modern illustration of the kind of transformative ecological impact that the Norse attributed to the wolf's sacred power. The reintroduction of a small number of wolves to Yellowstone, where they had been absent for 70 years, triggered a cascade of ecological changes that transformed the park's landscape in ways that no one had fully anticipated. Changes that biologists have described using the concept of a trophic cascade, a chain of effects that rippled through the entire ecosystem as the presence of wolves changed the behavior of elk, which changed the patterns of vegetation, which changed the course of rivers, which changed the structure of the landscape itself. This extraordinary demonstration of the wolf's power to reshape the physical world through the exercise of its predatory nature is, from a Norse perspective, entirely comprehensible within the framework of the wolf's sacred role as a creature whose hunger and whose power were fundamental to the maintenance of the natural order, whose removal from the landscape created an imbalance that could only be corrected by the wolf's return. The Norse, who understood Fenrir as the cosmic wolf whose binding caused distortions in the natural order and whose eventual release would inaugurate the transformation of the world, were expressing, in mythological language, an ecological intuition about the consequences of removing the wolf from its proper place in the web of life that modern conservation biology has now confirmed with extraordinary precision and detail. The raven's ecological role as a keystone, scavenger, and seed disperser has received less popular attention than the wolf's role as a keystone predator, but it is equally significant and equally consistent with the Norse understanding of the raven as a creature whose activities were fundamental to the maintenance of the cosmic order, and their global resonance with audiences across vastly different cultural contexts suggests that the spiritual truths that the Norse expressed through their sacred animal relationships are not culturally specific but touch on something universal in the human experience of consciousness and nature and mortality. The God of War video game series, which in its 2018 installment moved the setting of the story from Greek mythology to Norse mythology and placed the player in the role of the Greek hero Kratos, navigating the Norse mythological world alongside his son Atreus, provides a particularly interesting case study in the modern reception of the Norse sacred animal tradition, because it engages with the mythological material with a degree of seriousness and fidelity to the original sources that is unusual in popular entertainment, and that has resulted in a treatment of wolves and ravens that, while obviously adapted to the needs of an interactive entertainment medium, preserves significant elements of the original spiritual complexity. Ravens appear throughout the game as objects of attention and as markers of the presence of the divine, and the wolves of Norse mythology appear in various forms that reflect their multiple mythological roles, from the companions of the gods to the great cosmic wolves of the Ragnarok prophecy. The game's treatment of Ragnarok, in which the forces of destruction that have been building throughout the narrative are finally released in a cataclysm that the protagonists can mitigate but not prevent, captures something of the genuine Norse understanding of the relationship between fate and agency, between the inevitability of destruction and the meaningfulness of the struggle against it. And this thematic fidelity to the Norse mythological tradition gives the game's treatment of wolves and ravens a resonance that goes beyond mere visual spectacle and touches on the genuine philosophical concerns that the original mythology was wrestling with. The contemporary Norse pagan revival, known by various names including Asatru, heathenry, and Norse reconstructionism, represents the most direct modern attempt to recover and practice the spiritual tradition from which the Norse sacred animal relationship emerged, and its treatment of wolves and ravens provides a fascinating case study in the challenges and the possibilities of spiritual reconstruction in a modern context. Asatru, which emerged as a formal religious movement in Iceland in the early 1970s and has since spread to many other countries, particularly in the English-speaking world and in Scandinavia, is explicitly committed to the recovery and the practice of pre-Christian Norse spiritual traditions, drawing on the Eddic texts and the saga literature and the archaeological evidence to reconstruct as faithfully as possible the beliefs and practices of the Viking Age. Within the Asatru community, wolves and ravens occupy the same central position in the sacred cosmology that they held in the original Norse tradition, with Odin's wolves and ravens featuring prominently in devotional practices, in ritual imagery, and in the personal, spiritual relationships that individual practitioners develop with various aspects of the Norse divine world. The Asatru movement's engagement with the Norse sacred animal tradition raises important questions about the nature of spiritual reconstruction and the extent to which a tradition that was developed in a specific historical and ecological context can be genuinely recovered and practiced in a radically different context. The Norse relationship with wolves and ravens was not merely a set of theological beliefs or ritual practices, but was embedded in a specific way of life, a specific relationship with a specific landscape, a specific set of daily encounters with real wolves and real ravens in a real northern environment. And the question of whether the spiritual dimensions of this relationship can be authentically reproduced in the absence of these ecological and contextual foundations is one that the Asatru community itself debates vigorously and thoughtfully. Some practitioners argue that the essential spiritual truths of the Norse sacred animal tradition are independent of their original context and can be accessed through study, through meditation, through ritual practice, and through deliberate cultivation of the qualities that wolves and ravens represent, qualities of strength and intelligence and awareness and courage that are as relevant in the modern world as they were in the Viking Age. Others argue that genuine engagement with the Norse sacred animal tradition requires a more direct and more embodied relationship with the actual animals, with real wolves and real ravens in real natural environments